Hey, I'm Soundole, and I'm joined here today by the very multi-talented Chris Remo, a video game journalist, developer, and composer whose recent credits include Firewatch, Gone Home, and 30 Fights of Loving. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start off by talking about your experience with Firewatch. I think it's fair to say that this was a runaway success. You sold over 1 million copies of this in 2016. While you were working on it, did you have the sense that this would strike a chord in your audience, or did its success come as more of a surprise to you?
I think we were very proud of it and confident in it, but I think it did about, honestly, as well or better as any of us would have reasonably hoped or expected. I would not have assumed the game would have taken off the way it did. I think we made something we're really proud of for sure, but also lucked out in some ways. You know, there's a degree of kind of catching on that is difficult to guarantee or plan for, definitely. And I don't know. It's hard to entirely know when or why those things happen, but I was very, very gratified by it.
Awesome. So you also wore many hats during the development of that. You weren't just acting as a composer. What sort of work were you doing outside music for that?
Yeah, I mean, music was, I would estimate probably was about 10% of my time on Firewatch. I was a designer and I was on the story team. And so much of what I was doing throughout the game was helping to sort of put the kind of big pieces together and figure out what is the arc of this game in the macro sense, and then in the micro sense, how do we actually implement that scene by scene and location by location and day by day, because we split the game up into days, which was one of the structural elements that I worked on. And so over the course of the game, that sort of shifted from big, large scale kind of blue sky questions of, what do we want this to happen? What do we want to happen? And working with the writer Sean Vanneman, who figured out. I mean, he wrote basically every line of dialogue in the game, but we, worked in a small group within the team to figure out kind of what are the big beats and what needs to happen to give the thing its shape. And then by the end of production, that was a lot of really, really fiddly implementation of like, okay, well, so if players have had this conversation, but they chose this thing, but they went here instead of there first, then we have to make sure that it doesn't fall apart when they go over here. It was a lot of very kind of deep in the weeds design work on that level. And then music was I also did all the sound implementation on the game. I did about half of the sound design and all of the sound implementation, working with an external sound designer, Jared Emerson Johnson, who was really great. And then music I kind of treated like game design, honestly. The soundtrack, you never in the course of the game hear the same piece of music more than once. Every piece of music you hear is a result. So some of it is scored to specific scenes, definitely, but a lot of it, I would say maybe most of it, is the result of kind of rules set up in the world that are measuring things like how long it's been since you've had a conversation and what path you're taking and so on. And the goal is to try to insert music when it's most needed. When it's sort of the most dead air is happening is when you'll get that little like burst of music to kind of lift you up a bit. So I treated the music implementation as sort of game design as well in that regard.
That's incredibly interesting. I mean, I think you can definitely tell that it feels like another integrated part of the experience and not something that was thought about at the end of the process. It does feel very integrated into the main game. So, of those roles, what did you enjoy doing the most? Was it just the musical side of things, or did the raw development intrigue you more?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see myself as a game developer generally, and music is one thing that I sort of have to offer. So I mean, I think the thing I enjoyed most, honestly, was just being involved at such a broad scale, and because that makes each individual component better. You know, it makes the music better, it makes the sound design better, it makes the game design better. I mean, that said, it might have been a little, maybe slightly too many things I was involved with on that game, just in terms of sort of practicality. You know, at times I felt stretched a little bit thin, but in a general sense, I do really like just the totality of kind of having my finger in a lot of different parts of the pie, and sort of being aware of all those things and letting them inform each other. I think that this is so. Other soundtracks I've done have definitely been more of a you know, contract composer kind of situation. And I mean, there's something really great about that too. You can just sort of live in the music and just think about the music as music and as score, basically, you know, as sort of scoring scenes and scoring images. But all in all, I definitely prefer a more involved role. And I've done different things in games over the years. I've written games, you know, I've obviously in this case served as a designer. I've been on the production team. So I've done a lot of different things over the years, and this is the first time when those all kind of happen simultaneously on a single project.
Huh, cool. I imagine that's obviously much easier to have happen when you're working in a close-knit team. So you're always on site in the offices there making that happen. Yeah.
Yep, full-time employee.
Cool. Well, just talking about the compositional stuff, you use a pretty diverse array of genres and styles, from folk and rock to atmospheric synth-driven stuff. Is there a style that you more naturally gravitate towards, or more naturally start writing in, or prefer to write in? Or is it sort of informed by the project more?
It's a good question. I think it is in equal parts probably informed by the project, and also informed by, and I suppose anyone would say this, but my own personal experience. I mean, I definitely think of, I have a music degree, but I definitely don't have an inflated sense of my compositional abilities. Like I'm very aware that my style is very personal and very practical in a lot of ways. I mean, I think honestly, what informs my style more than anything else is probably my sort of being a amateur rock musician and sort of having to record a bunch of different parts myself, you know, in a sort of 4-track situation. And that's when this isn't true for all the soundtrack work I've done, but certainly Firewatch and Gone Home both felt like that, especially Gone Home, sort of me sitting in a little box, fiddling around with stuff and sort of figuring out what I can layer in interesting ways with what I have on hand. I've never been in a situation where I've had access to an orchestra or something like that. So a lot of my style is driven by sort of practical necessity and the kind of thing that I can get away with specific sort of scope of resources, I guess.
I read in one of your previous interviews that you had instrumentation as a characterization idea in Gone Home, and the instruments that you're using over various cues and tracks changed throughout the game. Did you have that same sort of idea in your mind for Firewatch?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, Gone Home definitely was a case of instrumentation on almost a per character basis, or sort of a per subject matter basis. Firewatch kind of had that, but ended up actually being more motif driven. I don't really know how much this comes through in the soundtrack. Probably not, because it's probably not that much, because it's not, I mean, as you know, if you've listened to it, it's not necessarily a very assertive soundtrack, except in a few cases. It's very much at least I think of it as being something that's very much kind of in the background, kind of enhancing the environments and scenes you're in. But by about halfway through development, and the soundtrack work sort of just spread across development, averaged out over the course of development, I started paying a lot more attention to assigning specific musical themes and motifs to characters that are involved. The characters, I mean, Firewatch is weird because you really only ever see one character, which is yourself. You're almost never directly in the presence of other characters, but these other characters are very present through all the conversations you have and the materials you find. And so I started sort of assigning motifs to these different characters and then lacing them in when, for instance, you find out about Brian Goodwin, and then Ned Goodwin has a theme, and there's different these different characters and plot lines kind of assert themselves through these musical motifs that come up, and then over the course of the game, those motifs will use different instrumentation depending on sort of emotionally what is going on in the game.
Cool. That's fascinating. Thanks for that. Speaking more generally, you've been working on a multitude of projects with studios of different levels over the last decade. What general trends do you think you've noticed in the indie game industry over the last 10 years?
That's a good question. I mean, I started off in AAA, so I started off working at Irrational Games on BioShock Infinite, and then went to Double Fine, which is a company I'd had experience with many years prior to that. And Double Fine is kind of it's a very large indie, so it's not necessarily, I don't know that I would necessarily consider it like indie games per se, just because it's a 60-person studio. But I do think over the last several years on the kind of small to mid-scale indie, and I would say I would consider us probably a mid-scale indie, we're just under a dozen people or so. I think something that has happened definitely, especially in the last 5 years, is that the overall quality bar has risen shockingly quickly, to the point that calling something indie, you don't really get any kind of pass on production values. And I think something that's become really important for indies is figuring out almost tricks, or maybe not tricks, but sort of approaches and overall mentalities that will help serve as a multiplier on your input as developers, so that the output onto the screen is much bigger proportionally than what goes in.
Do you think the tool sets that are available to be used have improved drastically over that time?
Yeah, it is incredible. It's unbelievable how much better and more empowering the tools are now. And I swear it's like on a monthly basis it gets more impressive. We use Unity. I know obviously a lot of indies have recently in the last couple of years started using Unreal as they've had more kind of opportunities there, but we're a Unity studio just for various reasons. And so I can't speak to the Unreal side, which I haven't used since I was at Irrational, but I assume it's very similar to this, just constantly, again, sort of on a monthly basis. Unity itself will release updates, but also through the asset store, the community will release new tools and assets that are just incredible. I mean, if I'm not an artist, that's the main sort of section of the game I don't have input to, but just being aware of some of that stuff, tools like Substance Designer and Substance Painter, tools that are bringing, on the one hand, more of a sort of procedural attitude towards asset creation. On the other hand, more of a sort of intuitive like authoring framework where you can sort of think of things in terms of their real world properties, which is just sort of more intuitive to artists, but also more intuitive to everyone, mean that on the one hand, the tools are more accessible to just people generally. I mean, you still obviously need some kind of technical grounding, but definitely more accessible generally. And then also just are resulting in much more impressive output for a lot less expense and man hours and everything else. It's crazy. I mean, so the result is that you get games that look and sound and feel incredible, even coming from smaller teams. And so I think people who are buying games and playing games, their expectations are just ratchet it up, and every time the expectations go up a bit, they don't come back down. And that's, I mean, it's, on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, it's really, really tough as a team. I mean, just because the tools are good doesn't mean you can automatically make something great. You still have to have the sort of creative baseline to actually use those tools to create something good. And it, on the one hand, it's very sort of thrilling and incredible to see, and on the other hand, it's very intimidating that those expectations just keep rising.
That's a very interesting point. If you look at something like the progression of experimental games that have brought us up to things like the Beginner's Guide. The Beginner's Guide is not just somebody's first attempt at making a mod in Half-Life 2. It's the product of a long, detailed development cycle. And that's sort of a technical low line in terms of what's being achieved there. You know what I mean? There's... Even the experimental games are still producing technical marvels at this point, so I can see how that would be very intimidating for anyone starting up with this. That in mind, do you have any advice for anyone looking into a career as an indie developer or as an indie composer?
It's a good question. I mean, those are two very different things in terms of what I would recommend. I would say, as an indie developer, it's probably useful to have some grounding in larger scale development, because I think it's useful for, well, it's not necessarily, it is certainly not required to be an indie developer. It is definitely not necessary to go into larger scale development before doing indie development, but it's very useful for some people, at least on an indie team, to have had that experience, because I think it gives you a perspective on things like scope and sort of team interaction that, because they have to hang together in a larger team, have to be, you kind of just have to get used to making certain kinds of decisions and compromises that are really, really useful. I mean, I think one of the absolute most important things for an indie team is the ability to scope and be realistic and to cut when necessary. I mean, we had to do a lot of that on Firewatch, and I would be shocked if there were any successful indie project that didn't. And I think working on slightly large scale development can be useful in terms of sort of forcing that perspective, because that just has to happen. As a composer, I don't know, it's tough to say. I've never been a full-time composer, so I can't really necessarily offer direct experience on what would sort of help facilitate such a career. But I will say that to the extent that I can offer advice on a career in video game composition, I would give the same advice I would give to any other individual collaborator, which a composer usually is, which is that you should make and maintain individual creative collaborations and partnerships over as long a period of time as you possibly can. I'm, in addition to my game development roles, I'm a podcaster. I do a podcast called Important If True. I do a video game podcast called Idle Thumbs, and a number of others on our website, Idle Thumbs. And the reason I bring that up is because my sort of longest term co-host on that, Nick Brecken and Jake Rodkin. Jake and I co-founded that site with some other folks back in 2004, and I still work with Jake to this day, both on Idle Thumbs but also on Firewatch, for instance. Steve Gaynor, who designed Gone Home and now Tacoma, who I worked with obviously on Gone Home, but also at Irrational Games together, he was a long-time contributor to the original Idle Thumbs website back in, I want to say 2005 or 2006. The majority of the direct collaborations I have today are the result of very long-term friendships and collaborations, stretching back, in the case of Jake, 15 years now. And it took years for those things to blossom into the kind of professional, sort of make a living kind of partnerships that they are now. But I pursued them because of genuine interest and friendship, and because I learned so much from those people, and not as a sort of mercenary, like, I mean, when we became friends, literally none of us were actually in the video game industry, so it would have been impossible for me to have been operating out of some kind of cynicism. But I bring it up because in retrospect, that was the most useful thing I ever could have done for my career, was be friends and collaborators with people who are smarter than I am, who I can learn from, who I enjoy working with. Because if you can maintain those relationships for years, when any of you become successful, that increases the likelihood that you yourself will have opportunities. And a thing that happens to me frequently in this industry, and I know this happens to a lot of people, is you'll meet students, or you'll meet whoever at some kind of event or something, and they'll sort of ask you for a job or ask you for this or that. And like, I totally get that. I get it, but it's not like, there's very rarely anything I can personally do. It's like I can't. That isn't. I saw a quote the other day where someone said, "Don't ask people for opportunities, offer them help." And there's networking doesn't mean just like go up to people and ask them for a job, because there just aren't enough jobs for it to work that way. You have to sort of cultivate those things. And I think that stuff works better most of the time with peers, because you can help each other, in a collaborative way, maintain relationships where you are feeding into each other, teaching each other things, learning from each other, contributing to each other's projects, and then hopefully you also grow together, both in your ability and in your actual career and opportunities. That was a very long answer, but I strongly believe that partnerships and collaborations and genuine sort of creative friendships are the most useful thing you can do.
That's definitely been what I've observed. I'm more just part of the VGM cover community, but anybody that goes from that cover community into finding professional work is not doing it by printing up business cards to hand them out at conventions.
Right,
it's because
that's exactly right.
Those go
in the trash, I guarantee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So lastly, I've just got one other technical question, because I'm really into all of your electric piano sounds, and I've seen from of your other interviews that you've got a very unique sort of electric piano in your studio. I'll cut away to some
it's in my home actually, yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I'll cut away to some of the music that I'm talking about that this is used in. So that's an amazing sound. What can you tell us about this instrument?
It is manufactured by a company in New Jersey called Vintage Vibe, and they're really great if you are not familiar with them. They are, as far as I'm aware, the only company still making new mechanical electric pianos. They started out by being a company that serviced aging Wurlitzer and Rhodes pianos, and eventually using the many years of expertise they built up in doing that.
So can you explain how a mechanical electric piano differs from most of the other electric pianos that exist today?
Well, I think when a lot of people hear the phrase electric piano, what they think of is synthesizer. But an electric piano is actually a true mechanical instrument that uses hammers the way when a traditional piano that anyone would think about, it strikes a reed or a tine physically and amplifies that sound. An electric piano is to a piano basically what an electric guitar is to a guitar. They're real acoustic instruments that are generating sound physically, not through electronic means. They're simply amplified, and that gives them a unique sound that is not that we associate with the sort of electric versions of these instruments. And electric piano, and because synthesizers are so powerful and cost effective, they've sort of displaced electric pianos, which makes total sense. But there is something really wonderful about the mechanical action of a real electric piano, because you are legitimately playing a physical instrument that has all of the weight and physicality that a piano should.
Awesome. Very, very cool. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fantastic to hear your insights from the industry and into these games. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Take care.
Cheers.